Right, so GB Energy. Whilst not the only issue I'm highlighting in this video, we've heard a lot about that, haven't we? It's the one Labour loved to crow about, the one that was in their manifesto. Presented to us all as a nationalised panacea to all of our energy problems, many people still believing it will supply energy to us at a lower rate, green energy at that, and outcompete all the other energy companies, lowering our bills and taking back control of our energy. Energy security and no more threats from Vladimir Putin, boo hiss, even though his influence on our energy was actually pretty minimal. He was a far bigger issue on the continent. The trouble is, GB Energy is nothing at all as it is often being presented. It won't produce any energy at all, and it's not even going to be financed for the most part by the public purse. It is little more than a quango to attract private investment to deliver the projects promised, and if that doesn't materialise, it will of course all completely fail. Meanwhile, back in fossil fuel land and in news you'll have seen scant coverage about, Labour has just overseen the sale of the last remaining bit of the publicly owned gas network to the company that happens to already now own all of the rest of it, giving one foreign company, a bank at that, a complete monopoly over our gas infrastructure. Starmer is not the answer to our energy security, he's actually a massive threat to it. Right, so energy security. After the last several years of seeing our bills soar out of hand, the government handing out large subsidies to the energy companies scalping us rather than legislating them back under control, which they could have done. Many of them, for example, exploit our own gas and oil fields on very favourable terms. It's not like they couldn't be put under the cosh. So it seemed this was all pretty safe territory for criticism, for Labour to win support by declaring they'd have no more of this if they were in government. Despite Starmer himself undermining that message somewhat by declaring he wouldn't cancel new oil and gas licences that Rishi Sunak happened to be creating back then, though. But now that Labour and Starmer are in power, they've got to prove their credentials on all of this, haven't they? Well, it's got off to a bit of a shaky start, hasn't it? As soon as GB Energy, for example, was dug into, it readily turned out it wouldn't be producing any energy at all, and, well, let's face it was already being questioned heavily when it was announced it wouldn't be a supplier to us as an energy company, but instead to energy distributors and generators, the very same companies that had already been scalping us. In point of fact, therefore, cheaper energy, greener energy, was it seemed to be produced wholesale for them to make even larger profit margins on. That is where some of Labour's supposed growth was, we thought, going to come from, even though there was scant sign they'd be taxed any more than the Tories taxed them previously, which amounted to minimal mates rates for these energy companies, or not at all, in fact, in exchange for their investment in those aforementioned oil and gas fields that we already own, because we didn't invest ourselves in them. It is negligent to not use our money, public money, to invest in our country, in our stuff, to deliver services. But the Tories would never do it, kissing backside to the private sector, allowing them to profiteer. And so GB Energy seems to show Labour under Starmer will be no different on that score. GB Energy is supposedly this quango, therefore, a government investment body basically where we, or by we I mean the public purse, put some £8.3 billion of seed money in to convince the private sector to come and invest in the green energy infrastructure the country needs, which Labour hopes will mean for every pound of public money they put in, the private sector will put in another £3. Who will own what gets produced at the end of the day, in which case? Who will own the new onshore wind farms? Who will employ the supposed 68,000 people in Scotland who would gain employment off the back of all of this? GB Energy, based in Scotland, as Starmer promised in his big pitch to the Scottish people who subsequently voted in 37 Labour MPs across their 57 parliamentary seats, and who have loyally voted exactly as Starmer has directed them to do. Seems like you might have got scammed, guys. Where the transference to green energy is of course necessary, by still not owning it wholesale ourselves in effect, the refusal to renationalise our energy, a pledge Starmer was elected Labour leader to deliver, but of course he lied about, we leave ourselves open to be scalped for profits to fill shareholders' pockets yet again, even as the country moves to greener energy. Will such profits be properly taxed this time? Well, that would remain to be seen as well. The excuse inevitably will be that they need to keep as much money as possible to keep on investing in better renewals, the research and development of greater technology. That will not end any more than the search for new oil and gas fields does now. There is therefore zero reason to hope that investors will be taxed any more favourably for the exchequer over renewable energy than over oil and gas today. We get scammed, we pay more than we should on our bills, they get let off taxation, economic benefit remains minimal. capitalism in a nutshell. And as for energy security, well, we end up beholden to the whims of those owning the infrastructure, don't we? And if you think this is a flight of fancy, that Labour are different, that they won't go down this same road like the Tories did, then I hate to break it to you, but Starmer already has. And if you really don't think he's continuity Tory still, then you really do need to hear this. In January of 2023, the National Grid, under the Tories, completed the sell-off of 60% of the UK's 7,000 kilometres of gas network pipeline. Did you hear about this? Probably not. Flogging the family silver, as always seems to happen when the Tories are in power. If you thought there wasn't much left to sell, then they certainly proved they went looking for it. They certainly didn't step in to protect our gas infrastructure here. For as much as you can pick and choose, albeit to a much lesser extent than you could before, your gas supplier, the gas infrastructure, the pipes that carry the gas, the meters and all the other physical paraphernalia that connect you to the gas network, was owned by the public under the name of National Gas. Anyway, 60% of National Gas itself effectively got flogged off under the Tories for £4.2 billion to Macquarie, an Australian-Canadian joint investment consortium, banksters. If you've heard of Macquarie already, you'll be groaning inwardly, I'm sure. If you haven't, I'll come on to that in a moment, and you probably will end up groaning inwardly. I'm sure it hasn't escaped you that this sell-off would have been going on whilst our energy bills were still stupidly high due to the actions of private companies exploiting our privatised energy sector. But the National Grid went on to sell Macquarie a further 20% of National Gas in July of last year for another $700 million, leaving us with just 20% of National Gas. Well, not anymore. Under Starmer's Labour, the National Grid just sold Macquarie the last remaining 20%, so they now own 100% of our gas infrastructure. It got sold to Macquarie. An Australian-Canadian conglomerate owns all of our gas pipeline network and associated odds and sods. Now, just to clarify matters here, strictly speaking, the sales were all transacted between Macquarie and the National Grid, who owned National Gas. Now, you might think we still own the National Grid. Why did our government not step in? But actually, we never have owned it. From the moment the National Grid was created in 1990, it was floated on the stock exchange, and one of its biggest investors today is another notorious bank in the form of BlackRock, which owns nearly 10% of it. So given this knowledge, perhaps it's no surprise the National Grid has sold off National Gas to Macquarie in its entirety. Our infrastructure might be essential to us, but it's just business to them, just an investment venture to be bought and sold to the corporations, a commodity. However, the government can still step in. For example, in 2022, before the Macquarie sales began, the Tories moved to renationalise part of the National Grid to ensure the lights would be kept on via a new public body they called the Future Systems Operator, due to come into force this year as it happens. But with the changes in government, things have shifted slightly. This responsibility, in an announcement that came just this morning actually, is, according to Ofgem, going to be the remit of a company called Elexon, which is itself owned by, well, the National Grid. The claim is they are independent from the parent group, but that'll need to be seen to be believed. Seems like a fast one's being pulled here again. Labour are overseeing the complete acquisition of our gas pipeline infrastructure, though. Certainly points to them being continuity Tory on one hand, but then they are complaining about the state of our rivers and other water courses and making a lot of noise over that. For example, over the Thames water debacle, as a sign of what happens when private corporations take control of our essential infrastructure and are not clamped down on firmly enough. That inevitably ends up leading to public money being needed to bail them out and start to clean our water up. We always end up paying, don't we? Well, that brings us conveniently back to Macquarie, as it happens, as this excerpt from the Canary explains. The Australian bank that has been dubbed the vampire kangaroo by its critics has become the sole owner of Britain's gas pipeline network after buying the remaining stake it did not already own. A consortium led by Macquarie Asset Management has bought the remaining 20% holding in National Gas for about £700 million in a deal with National Grid. Why, you might ask, has Macquarie been dubbed the vampire kangaroo? Take a look at Thames Water and you'll understand why. The Financial Times wrote, Macquarie is the biggest private sector owner of infrastructure assets in the world and one of the largest in the UK, with stakes in everything from wind farms to airports and telecoms networks. It is best known for its former ownership of crisis hit Thames Water. Macquarie's ownership of Thames Water has been widely criticised after the utility's debt increased from £3.4 billion in 2006, when it bought into the business, to £10.8 billion when it sold its final stake in 2017, according to Financial Times research. About £2.7 billion was taken out in dividends and £2.2 billion in loans during that period, although Macquarie has said it spent £11 billion from customer bills on infrastructure. Yeah, Macquarie are called blood-sucking vampires because they bleed services dry and then dump them on someone else. They screwed Thames Water over, making it one of the biggest infrastructure crises the incoming Labour government was tasked to deal with, upon which point Starmer probably went to Ukraine instead. And now on Starmer's watch, they can do the same to the provision of our gas supply to all of our homes. And possibly, with GB Energy looking for private investment and with Macquarie already investing in wind farms itself, they might well want to invest in that too. And if you think all this can't possibly be true, the Canary also expanded on this point. National Gas runs the main pipelines across the UK, but as the Financial Times noted, gas gets to our homes via smaller networks of pipes that are run by other companies. Guess who owns some of these? Macquarie already owns a stake in Cadent, which runs half of the 8 local gas distribution networks, but has been trying to cut its position, joining forces with another shareholder to sell a combined £1.3 billion stake in the company. It is understood that the sale is part of a standard portfolio rebalancing, and that Macquarie will still retain a sizable 20% stake in Cadent, which provides gas to 11 million homes and businesses in England. So Macquarie will not only own the whole of the UK's main gas pipes, but will also own a big chunk of the smaller pipes too. How much might our gas supply be affected by more portfolio rebalancing, and who is getting a chance to buy into the sale of Macquarie acquisitions later on then? The question of whether we have a say in any of this, as far as I'm concerned, is a moot point though. This was always our property. It was our property to begin with. It was stolen by the Tories. Thatcherism is legalised state theft of property that belongs to all of us and is meant to work in our interest. That was the con that was pulled. Legislate it all back under state control, because frankly without that we don't have energy security anymore. And I hope that is becoming more and more obvious to more and more people. And not just in relation to energy either, but to water, steel and everything else Thatcher began the theft of that has just continued ever since. Honestly, any government refusing to do this, as Starmer's lot are, with those profiteering for that decades-old theft, and against all of us. For more details on the state of Thames Water and the story behind that one, Macquarie and all, check out this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.